My name is Morgan Riley, and I'm 32 years old. I own an antique shop that my family always dismissed as a hobby rather than a real career. They called me the antique shop girl, with barely concealed disappointment. What they didn't know was that beneath my modest storefront lay a fortune worth $15 million. Last Thanksgiving, when they discovered my secret, everything changed. The people who once looked down on me suddenly wanted a piece of what I'd built. Before I tell you how my own family tried to rob me of everything I worked for, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against the people who should have supported you the most. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Portland, where success was measured by degrees and job titles. My parents, Richard and Linda Riley, were obsessed with status and conventional achievements. Dad was an accountant with a large firm, and Mom taught mathematics at the local high school. They had their lives mapped out for themselves and for their children too. From the beginning, there was a clear favorite in our family. My younger sister Abigail was the golden child who could do no wrong. She was studious, obedient, and followed the path our parents laid out without question. 3 years younger than me, Abigail was the perfect daughter who pursued a law degree, just as our parents had always dreamed. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. While Abigail was winning debate competitions and acing standardized tests, I was wandering through flea markets and garage sales, fascinated by objects with history. I remember finding an old brass compass at a yard sale when I was 9 years old. The metal was tarnished, but the needle still spun true, and the previous owner told me it had belonged to his grandfather, who was a sea captain. I spent my allowance on it without hesitation. "Why would you waste your money on someone else's junk?" my mother asked. Her lips pinched with disapproval when I proudly showed her my treasure. "It's not junk, Mom. It has a story." I tried to explain, but she was already walking away, shaking her head. While other parents displayed their children's sports trophies and academic awards, mine hid my collection of vintage postcards and antique thimbles when guests came over. "Morgan has unusual hobbies," they'd say with tight smiles if anyone asked about me. When I announced my intention to study art history in college, my parents reacted as if I'd said I was joining the circus. "Art history? What kind of career is that?" my father demanded over dinner. "You'll be waiting tables for the rest of your life." "I can work in museums or galleries, or even restoration," I argued. "Those are hobbies, not careers," my mother chimed in. "At least consider business administration with an art minor." But I stood my ground. It was one of the first times I'd ever defied them directly, and the tension at home became nearly unbearable. They agreed to pay for college only after I promised to come to my senses eventually. College was liberating. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who shared my passions. I thrived in my classes, especially those focused on American colonial artifacts and furniture. My professors recognized my eye for detail and my ability to spot authentic pieces among reproductions. The real breaking point with my family came when I dropped out of the graduate program they'd reluctantly accepted. I had been working part-time at a local antique shop to help pay for school, and the owner, Harold Wellington, had become something of a mentor to me. Harold was in his 70s with a wealth of knowledge about American antiques that no textbook could match. He recognized something in me that even I hadn't fully understood, an intuitive sense for the stories objects could tell. "You have the touch, Morgan," he would say. "You can feel the history in these pieces." When Harold offered me a full-time position with the promise of eventually taking over his business, I knew it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. My parents were livid. "We didn't pay for your education so you could throw it away playing shopkeeper," my father shouted during what would become our last real conversation for years. "This is what I want to do," I insisted. "Harold is teaching me more than I could learn in any classroom." "Your sister is on her way to becoming a lawyer," my mother said, as she always did when she wanted to remind me of my inadequacies. "And you want to sell other people's trash." That night I packed my things and moved into a small apartment above Harold's shop. The family gatherings that followed were exercises in passive aggression. Every achievement of mine was minimized, while Abigail's accomplishments were celebrated endlessly. "Abigail just made law review," my mother would announce before turning to me with, "And how's your little shop doing, dear?" I learned to maintain a polite distance. I'd visit on major holidays, send appropriate gifts for birthdays and anniversaries, but I stopped sharing the details of my life. It was easier that way, less painful than watching their eyes glaze over with disinterest, or worse, spark with disapproval. But deep down, I still hoped for their acceptance. Each time I'd discover a remarkable piece or make a significant sale, there would be a moment when I'd reach for the phone wanting to share my excitement with them. I never made those calls. Instead, I poured my energy into learning everything Harold could teach me. He became the parent figure I needed, one who valued my passion and believed in my potential. "Family isn't just blood, Morgan," he told me once after I'd confided about my parents. "It's who sees the real you and loves you anyway." Those words sustained me through years of strained family dinners and conditional acceptance. Little did I know how prophetic they would prove to be when my family finally discovered who the antique shop girl had really become. With Harold's mentorship, I began building my business from the ground up. I started small renting booths at flea markets and haunting estate sales for undervalued treasures. I had a knack for spotting the diamond in the rough, the piece with historical significance that others overlooked. After saving every penny for 2 years, I opened my own tiny shop in a side street off the main downtown area. I named it Timeless Treasures, simple but fitting. The location wasn't ideal, and the space was barely larger than my apartment living room, but it was mine. I remember standing in that empty shop the day I got the keys, spinning around with my arms outstretched, drunk on possibility. The reality of small business ownership quickly sobered me up. The first 2 years were brutal. There were days when not a single customer walked through the door. I survived on ramen noodles and coffee, pouring every dollar back into inventory. I'd sit in the shop until late at night researching items I'd purchased, learning everything I could about authentication and provenance. My parents, on their rare visits to the shop, would look around with thinly veiled disapproval. "It's quaint," my mother would say in the same tone she might use to describe a child's crayon drawing. "Not exactly bustling with customers, is it?" my father would observe, glancing at his watch as if counting the minutes until he could leave. Harold was my rock during those lean times. "This business isn't about quick profits," he'd remind me. "It's about patience, knowledge, and relationships. The money will come if you focus on the quality." He was right. The turning point came unexpectedly on a rainy Sunday morning at an estate sale in an affluent neighborhood. Most buyers had already picked through what they considered the valuable items, but something drew me to an old desk shoved in the corner of the garage. It was covered in years of grime and had clearly been used as a workbench for decades. But beneath the dirt and paint splatters, I recognized the distinctive joinery and proportions of colonial craftsmanship. I paid $200 for it, nearly wiping out my purchasing budget for the month. The seller seemed relieved to be rid of it. "That old thing's been taking up space for years," she said as she helped me load it into my van. Back at the shop, I spent weeks carefully cleaning and researching the desk. Layer by layer, its secrets revealed themselves. The wood was black walnut, the hardware was original brass, and most importantly, hidden inside a secret compartment was a partial letter dated 1782. Further research and authentication confirmed my suspicions. The desk had been crafted by a renowned Philadelphia cabinet maker for a prominent merchant with ties to the Continental Congress. I contacted a collector I'd met through Harold, who specialized in American colonial furniture. When he saw the desk and the documentation I'd compiled, he offered $75,000 on the spot. I nearly fainted. That single sale paid off my business loans and gave me the capital to expand. Word spread in collector circles about the young dealer with the good eye. I began receiving calls from serious buyers looking for specific pieces. I expanded my network, attending auctions and developing relationships with estate lawyers and historical societies. I moved the shop to a larger location in a more prominent area and hired my first employee, a graduate student in historical preservation. As my business grew, so did my knowledge. I took courses in authentication techniques and invested in specialized equipment. I traveled to museums and private collections studying the finest examples of American craftsmanship. Each discovery, each successful authentication, each sale built my reputation and my confidence. Throughout this period of growth, my family's dismissal of my career never wavered. At our annual Thanksgiving gatherings, my parents would introduce me as Morgan, our daughter who has that antique shop. The emphasis always seemed to fall on that as if my business were a curious hobby rather than a thriving enterprise. Abigail, now working at a prestigious law firm, would ask patronizing questions like, "Do you actually make enough to live on selling old furniture?" Or, "Have you thought about getting a real job with benefits?" I learned to smile and change the subject. What they didn't know, what I deliberately kept from them, was that my little shop was now grossing over $500,000 annually. I had expanded to online sales, developed a clientele that included celebrities and museum curators, and was being featured in industry publications. Harold watched my success with pride. "You've surpassed even my expectations," he told me on the 5th anniversary of my shop's opening. "You've built something remarkable, Morgan." His approval meant everything to me. When he was diagnosed with cancer the following year, I was devastated. I spent as much time with him as possible during his final months, soaking up his stories and wisdom. Before he passed, he surprised me by revealing that he was leaving me his personal collection, pieces he'd gathered over 50 years in the business, many of them museum quality. "You'll know what to do with them," he said, squeezing my hand. "You see their value not just in dollars, but in the stories they tell." After Harold's death, I threw myself into my work even more intensely. I was determined to build a legacy that would honor his faith in me. Little did I know that the greatest discovery of my career was just around the corner. One that would change everything, including my family's perception of the antique shop girl. The discovery that would transform my life came about through a combination of luck, instinct, and relationships I'd built over years in the business. An auctioneer I knew called me about a storage unit that had been abandoned for decades. The contents were being sold off to cover back rent, but the auctioneer thought I might be interested in some old papers he'd glimpsed inside. "Probably nothing," he said, "but it reminded me of that Revolutionary War document you authenticated last year." I drove 3 hours to a nondescript storage facility on the outskirts of a small coastal town. The unit was packed with furniture covered in dust and boxes that hadn't been opened in years. In the back corner, protected somewhat by a tarp, was a large wooden chest with brass fittings. The moment I opened that chest, I knew I'd found something extraordinary. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved documents, letters, maps, and journals dating from the 1760s through the 1790s. Initial examination revealed correspondence between prominent Revolutionary War figures, including several letters signed by founding fathers. There were also military maps with strategic notations, financial records from the early Continental Congress, and personal journals from a merchant who had supplied the Revolutionary Army. My hands were shaking as I carefully resealed the chest. I paid for the entire storage unit contents on the spot, $3,400 that would prove to be the investment of a lifetime. I reached out to Dr. Eleanor Winters, a historian I'd collaborated with on previous authentications. When she saw what I'd found, her academic composure cracked. "Morgan, if these are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, this is one of the most significant private collections of Revolutionary War documents discovered in decades," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. The authentication process was painstaking. We brought in specialists in historical paper ink analysis and handwriting experts. We cross-referenced the content with known historical records. Each test confirmed what I'd instinctively known. The collection was genuine and of immense historical significance. News of the discovery leaked to the antique world. My phone began ringing constantly with calls from collectors' museums and auction houses. A reporter from an industry publication convinced me to give an interview, which led to features in national newspapers and history magazines. Suddenly, I wasn't just known in collector circles. My discovery had put me in the national spotlight. Major auction houses began competing for the right to handle the sale. After careful consideration, I chose a prestigious firm known for their expertise in American historical documents. They estimated the collection could bring between $5 and $8 million. The auction was scheduled for 6 months later, giving time for international marketing and for potential buyers to arrange financing. Those months were a whirlwind of activity. I provided access to researchers documenting the collection while maintaining strict security. The auction house produced an elaborate catalog featuring the collection's highlights. Pre-auction exhibitions were held in New York, London, and Paris. Throughout this period, I deliberately maintained my normal routine at the shop and kept a low profile about the impending auction. I mentioned nothing to my family. Years of their dismissal had taught me to protect my achievements from their judgment. When the auction day finally arrived, I sat in the front row, barely breathing as the bidding began. The collection had been divided into multiple lots to maximize value, with the most significant items offered individually. The first letter, signed by George Washington, sold for $875,000. I gripped the armrests of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time the final gavel fell, the collection had sold for a total of $15.3 million. The auction room burst into applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My financial advisor, Samantha West, was waiting for me after the press conference. "We need to make some decisions," she said calmly, as if we were discussing a minor windfall rather than a life-changing fortune. Over the next few weeks, we developed a comprehensive financial plan. I established a foundation to support historical preservation and education. I invested the majority of the proceeds in a diversified portfolio. And yes, I indulged in one significant luxury. I purchased and restored a historic home that had once belonged to a 19th century sea captain. Despite my newfound wealth, I kept my shop open. Timeless Treasures wasn't just a business to me. It was my passion, my connection to Harold, and the fulfillment of my lifelong love of history. I expanded the educational component, offering workshops and lectures on antique authentication and historical significance. Throughout this whirlwind, I maintained my usual minimal contact with my family. When my mother called to confirm my attendance at Thanksgiving, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to share my success with them, to finally prove that my little hobby had value. Perhaps now they would understand my choices. Perhaps now they would see me. With that hope flickering in my heart, I made a decision that would prove to be one of my biggest mistakes. I invited them to have Thanksgiving at my new home, and I resolved to finally open up about my success. Samantha warned me to be cautious. "Sudden wealth changes how people see you," she said. "Even family." "They're my family," I replied. "They might have been disappointed in my choices, but they've never been greedy people." How wrong I was. How painfully, catastrophically wrong. I spent weeks preparing for that Thanksgiving dinner. I wanted everything to be perfect when my family visited my new home for the first time. I hired a professional cleaner to make the 19th century sea captain's house sparkle. I ordered a heritage turkey from a local farm and practiced making my grandmother's stuffing recipe until I got it just right. I even brought in select pieces from my shop to showcase in the formal dining room. Nothing too ostentatious, but items that told stories I thought my family might finally appreciate. The morning of Thanksgiving, I arranged fresh flowers throughout the house and set the table with antique china I'd acquired from a New England estate. I was nervous but hopeful. Maybe this would be a new beginning for us. Maybe my success would finally bridge the gap between my family's expectations and the path I'd chosen. They arrived all together. My parents in their practical sedan, Abigail, and her fiancé Bradley in his shiny German sports car. Bradley was an investment banker with slicked back hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I'd met him briefly at a family dinner months earlier and found him calculating and cold, but he was exactly the type of successful, prestigious partner my parents had always envisioned for their favored daughter. "What a unique property," my mother said as she stepped into the foyer, her eyes scanning the restored woodwork and period details, with what looked like confusion rather than appreciation. Morgan, this place must have cost a fortune to maintain, my father added, frowning slightly. Those are all original fixtures. The insurance must be astronomical. I gave them a tour pointing out architectural details and the history of the house, hoping to spark some interest in what made it special to me. My father kept asking about property taxes and maintenance costs. My mother wondered aloud why I'd want all this space for just one person. Abigail seemed bored, checking her phone throughout the tour. Bradley, however, was surprisingly attentive, asking pointed questions about the renovation costs and property values in the neighborhood. At the time, I mistook his interest for genuine appreciation. I would later understand he was mentally calculating my net worth. As we settled in the living room for pre-dinner drinks, the conversation turned predictably to Abigail's accomplishments. She had recently been assigned to a high-profile case at her law firm, a detail my parents repeated with glowing pride. And the wedding plans are coming along beautifully, my mother added. The country club is booked for June. 300 guests. That sounds lovely, I said, trying to maintain my optimism for the evening. I'm looking forward to it. Yes, well, these things are expensive, my father said with a significant look at Abigail. But some things are worth investing in. The implied comparison hung in the air. Some things, like law degrees and country club weddings, were worth investing in. Antique shops and historic homes were not. Dinner began pleasantly enough. They complimented the food, and we managed some neutral conversation about cousins and old neighborhood acquaintances. I was just starting to relax when my father, reaching for more mashed potatoes, casually said, "Oh, I meant to ask. Was that you in that newspaper article about some revolutionary documents Richard at the office showed it to me? Said the dealer looked like you, but I told him my daughter's shop wasn't that kind of establishment." The table went silent. I hadn't planned to bring up the auction quite so abruptly, but the moment had presented itself. Actually, yes, that was me, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I discovered a collection of Revolutionary War documents in an abandoned storage unit last year. They turned out to be quite valuable. Valuable, my mother repeated. What does that mean in the antique world? A few $1,000s. I took a deep breath. The collection sold at auction for $15 million. Bradley's fork clattered against his plate. Abigail's head snapped up from her phone. My father's mouth opened and closed without sound. My mother froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. $15 million, my father finally managed, his voice hoarse. Yes, I said, cutting a piece of turkey. After taxes and fees, about $12 million. I've established a foundation for historical preservation, invested most of it, and bought this house, of course. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. Suddenly, everyone was intensely interested in my career. "Morgan, that's incredible," Abigail exclaimed, putting down her phone for the first time all evening. "Why didn't you tell us? We had no idea your shop was so successful."
Mom.
12 million liquid, Bradley murmured, clearly doing calculations in his head. Plus the property and business assets. Morgan, you must be worth close to 15 million net. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. My mother's expression had transformed from polite disinterest to something like awe, or perhaps calculation. All these years, my father said, shaking his head, we thought you were just, well, we didn't understand the potential in what you were doing. Clearly, I said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. I've been trying to tell you about my passion for years, but you never wanted to hear it. We were concerned for your future, my mother said quickly. Parents worry, you know, but you've proven us wrong and we couldn't be prouder. The sudden shift gave me emotional whiplash. After years of dismissing my career, they were now acting as if they'd supported me all along. As we moved to the living room for dessert, the questions began. How was I investing the money? Did I have good financial advisors? Had I thought about real estate development? Each question more probing than the last. Then came the first hint of what was really on their minds. You know, my father said casually, your sister has quite a bit of law school debt. now that you're in such a fortunate position, perhaps you could help her out. Family should support each other after all. And the wedding, my mother added. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could contribute, make it really special for your only sister? I looked at Abigail, who had the grace to blush slightly but quickly recovered. It would mean so much to us, Morgan, she said, reaching for Bradley's hand. And maybe you could advise Bradley on some investment opportunities he's considering. With your resources, you could really help us get started right. Bradley leaned forward eagerly. Actually, I've been looking at some ventures that need capital. High return potential. I'd be happy to walk you through the projections. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of thinly veiled suggestions and not so subtle hints. By the time they left, the warmth I'd hoped to create had been thoroughly chilled. They hugged me tightly at the door, my mother holding on longer than she had in years, my father patting my back with newfound approval. As I closed the door behind them, I leaned against it, a hollow feeling spreading through my chest. They hadn't seen me at all. They'd only seen the dollar signs. The week after Thanksgiving unleashed a flood of attention from my family unlike anything I'd experienced before. My phone rang constantly with calls from people who had barely acknowledged my existence for years. My father called first on Black Friday morning. "Morgan, I've been thinking about your situation," he began without preamble. "You need proper financial guidance. My firm has a wealth management division that handles high net worth clients. I've taken the liberty of setting up a meeting for you next week." Before I could respond, he continued, "And I wanted to mention a small investment opportunity. A colleague is developing a golf community outside Portland. Very exclusive. Minimum buy-in is $2 million, but I told him you might be interested in a more substantial position." I was stunned by his presumption. "Dad, I already have financial advisors I trust, and I'm not interested in golf community developments." "Morgan," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I knew so well, "you've done well finding valuable objects, but managing this level of wealth requires expertise. You can't just put $12 million in a savings account." "I'm well aware of that," I replied coolly. "My money is professionally managed in a diversified portfolio focusing on long-term growth and socially responsible investments." He seemed surprised by my confidence. The call ended awkwardly, but it was just the beginning. The next day, Abigail called in tears. "Morgan, I hate to ask this, but I'm in a terrible situation," she sobbed. "Bradley's got some gambling debts I didn't know about. We're talking serious money, Morgan. His bookie is threatening him." "Gambling debts?" I repeated, alarmed, but also suspicious of the timing. "How much are we talking about?" "300,000, she whispered. "I know it sounds like a lot, but to you now, it's nothing, right? Just a drop in the bucket. You wouldn't even miss it." The casual way she dismissed such a large sum shocked me. "Abigail, that's still a significant amount of money. And paying off gambling debts doesn't solve the underlying problem. Bradley needs help, not a bailout." "So you're refusing to help your own sister?" she snapped, tears instantly gone. "After all the years I supported you." "When did you ever support me?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I never criticized your little shop like Mom and Dad did," she shot back. "I was always nice about your weird hobby." The conversation deteriorated from there. By the end, she was threatening that I would regret my selfishness when I needed family support. My mother's approach was more subtle. She called every day that week, something she'd never done before. Each conversation began with superficial pleasantries before inevitably turning to money. "Your father and I are getting older, Morgan," she said during one call. "We've been thinking about retiring early, but our 401ks took such a hit during the last market downturn. It would be such a comfort to know our daughter could help if we needed it." When I didn't immediately offer financial support, she added, "We sacrificed so much for you girls. All those years of private school tuition and college expenses. We never took vacations so you could have every advantage." The guilt trips were expertly deployed. I found myself wavering, questioning whether I was being selfish. Wasn't family supposed to help family? Concerned about my emotional state, I scheduled an emergency session with my therapist, Dr. Sarah Bennett, who I'd been seeing since Harold's death, to work through my grief. What you're experiencing is a common reaction when someone comes into sudden wealth, Dr. Bennett explained. The people around you, even family, may see you differently, not as a person with feelings and boundaries, but as a resource to be tapped. But should I help them? I asked. They're my family after all. Morgan, giving from obligation or guilt rarely leads to healthy outcomes, she said gently. Consider what healthy support might look like for you, what you can give freely without resentment. And remember, financial boundaries are just as important as emotional ones. I also consulted with Samantha, my financial advisor. I've seen this scenario play out dozens of times, she told me frankly. Once you start, it rarely ends. The requests just get bigger and more frequent. Armed with this professional guidance, I made a decision. I would help my family in structured, limited ways that aligned with my values. I offered to contribute a reasonable amount to Abigail's wedding and set up educational trusts for any future nieces and nephews. I offered to pay for financial planning services for my parents' retirement. These offers were met with thinly veiled disappointment. That's thoughtful, my mother said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Though we were hoping for something more substantial. My father was more direct. Educational trusts. That's years away. We're talking about real needs now, Morgan. The first firm boundary I set, refusing to invest in Bradley's can't-miss opportunity that required a $2 million buy-in, resulted in an angry late-night call from Abigail. You've changed, she accused. The money has made you selfish and suspicious. We're your family. We're just asking for a little help getting established. $2 million was apparently a little help in her mind. The breaking point came when they showed up unannounced at my shop on a busy Saturday afternoon. All three of them, my parents and Abigail, walked in while I was with a client, a museum curator interested in a 19th century maritime chronometer. There she is, my father announced loudly. Portland's secret millionaire. The curator looked at me with raised eyebrows. Other customers turned to stare. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. I'm with a client, I said quietly but firmly. I'll call you later. This will just take a minute. My mother insisted, her smile tight. We have wonderful news. I excused myself and led them to my office in the back. This is completely inappropriate, I told them once the door was closed. You can't just barge into my place of business and announce my financial status to everyone. We thought you'd be excited, my father said, seemingly oblivious to my distress. We found the perfect investment opportunity for you, a resort development in Cabo. Triple your money in 5 years. And the best part, Abigail added eagerly, is that they're offering a management position for Bradley. We could relocate there, oversee your investment. It's perfect. I stared at them, finally seeing with complete clarity what was happening. They weren't interested in reconnecting with me. They saw me as nothing more than an ATM, a resource to be exploited for their benefit. No, I said simply. I'm not interested. The atmosphere in the room chilled instantly. You know, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet, your grandfather would be very disappointed to see how selfish you've become. Family takes care of family. Interesting you should mention that now, I replied, my own voice steady despite my racing heart. Where was that family loyalty when I was building my business? When I was working 18-hour days and living on ramen noodles? When Harold was teaching me everything you couldn't be bothered to take an interest in? That's different, my mother interjected. We were trying to guide you toward a more stable path. And now that my unstable path has made me wealthy, suddenly you're full of guidance about how I should spend my money. I finished for her. Please leave. My clients are waiting. They left, but not before Abigail dropped an envelope on my desk. It was her wedding invitation with a handwritten note specifying that they were expecting a suitably generous gift given my fortunate circumstances. That night I changed my phone number. The final confrontation came after 3 months of escalating demands and increasingly aggressive tactics from my family. Despite changing my phone number, they found ways to contact me. Emails, messages through mutual acquaintances, even notes left on my car. Each communication more desperate and entitled than the last. I had just returned from a business trip to an estate auction in Chicago when my security system alerted me to visitors at my front door. The camera showed my parents' car in the driveway with Abigail and Bradley standing on my porch. Exhausted from travel and emotionally drained from the ongoing situation, I almost didn't answer. But part of me hoped that perhaps after my extended absence, they had reflected on their behavior. I opened the door to find all four of them dressed as if for a business meeting. My father and Bradley in suits, my mother and Abigail in conservative dresses. Bradley carried a leather portfolio under his arm. "Morgan," my father said with forced joviality. "Good to see you. We've been trying to reach you." "I've been traveling," I replied neutrally. "What brings you all here dressed like this?" "We have a proposal," Bradley said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to closing deals. "A business proposition that benefits everyone." Against my better judgment, I invited them in. We sat in my living room, the tension palpable as Bradley opened his portfolio and extracted several glossy documents. "We've established an LLC," he explained, laying out what appeared to be business plans and financial projections. "Riley Family Enterprises. The concept is simple. We leverage your capital with our expertise to build a family business empire." I listened in growing disbelief as he outlined a plan that essentially amounted to me providing $2 million in initial funding for a series of ventures that would be managed entirely by him and my family. The presentation was slick, filled with impressive-sounding jargon and optimistic growth charts, but fundamentally empty of solid business strategy. "And the beauty of this arrangement," my father added enthusiastically, "is that it provides immediate income for all of us while building long-term family wealth." "Immediate income," I repeated. "Executive salaries," Bradley clarified smoothly. "You'd be chairman, of course, but non-operational. I'd serve as CEO, your father as CFO, and Abigail as legal counsel. Standard compensation packages for those roles." I glanced at the proposed salary figures and nearly choked. They had allocated themselves combined annual salaries of over $800,000 before the business had generated a single dollar in revenue. "And what exactly would this business do?" I asked. "We're keeping it flexible," Bradley replied vaguely. "Starting with real estate development, then diversifying into other opportunities as they arise." As they continued their pitch, my mother casually mentioned that they had already put a deposit on office space and commissioned a company logo. "We're prepared to move quickly once the funding is secured," she said confidently. "We've also been looking at properties," my father added. "There's a vacation home in Aspen that would make an excellent corporate retreat. We could all use it, of course." Then came the bombshell. "Your mother and I have already given notice at our jobs," my father announced. "We're ready to commit fully to this venture." "You quit your jobs?" I asked, stunned. "Before securing any funding." "We have complete faith in this plan," my mother said. "And in you, dear. We've also taken out a second mortgage on our house for initial expenses," my father added casually. "Just temporary, of course, until your investment comes through." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of their presumption. They had restructured their entire lives based on the assumption that I would hand over millions of dollars to fund their fantasy business. As I struggled to formulate a response, I noticed Abigail examining one of my display cabinets containing rare early American silver pieces. "These would look perfect in the executive reception area," she commented, as if my personal possessions were already company assets. "I've actually made a catalog of items from your collection that would enhance the corporate image," Bradley said, pulling out another document from his portfolio. "We can have them moved to the office next week." With a sick feeling, I realized they had been taking inventory of my antiques during their visits. They weren't just after my money, they were planning to appropriate my entire life's work. "There's something else we should discuss," Bradley said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Your shop. It's quaint, but it's not really aligned with the corporate image we're building. We're thinking it might be best to liquidate that inventory and redirect those resources." "Liquidate my shop," I repeated, my voice barely audible. "It's just good business sense," he continued, oblivious to my growing horror. "The return on those dusty antiques is minimal compared to what we could do with that capital properly invested. Besides, you won't have time for it once we launch the company." In that moment, everything crystallized. They didn't see me at all, not as a daughter, a sister, or even as a successful businesswoman. I was nothing more than a resource to be exploited, a fountain of wealth they felt entitled to redirect for their own benefit. I stood up slowly, gathering the scattered documents from my coffee table. "I've listened to your proposal," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "And my answer is no. Not just no to this specific plan, but no to all of it. No to funding your lifestyles, no to bankrolling Bradley's gambling debts disguised as business expenses, no to sacrificing my business that I built from nothing while you all mocked and dismissed me." "Morgan, be reasonable," my father began, but I cut him off. For years I was the antique shop girl, the disappointment, the one who didn't fit your narrow definition of success. You belittled my passion, dismissed my knowledge, and now that it's made me wealthy, you want to take control of it all. "That's not fair," my mother protested. "We're your family. We've always wanted what's best for you." "No, you've wanted what aligned with your vision for me," I corrected her. "And when I chose a different path, you withdrew your support and approval. Do you know who was there for me, Harold? Harold believed in me when you wouldn't even listen. He taught me, encouraged me, and left me his collection because he knew I would honor its historical significance, not liquidate it for a corporate retreat in Aspen." At the mention of Harold, my father's expression darkened. "That old man turned you against us, and now you choose his memory over your own family. That inheritance should have been contested. He took advantage of you." His words struck me like a physical blow. That they would disparage Harold, the one person who had truly supported me, was the final straw. "I think you should leave now," I said quietly. "You can't be serious," Abigail said, her voice rising. "After everything we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me, Abigail? When have any of you actually supported me or my dreams?" They stared at me in disbelief, as if the very question was incomprehensible to them. "This is your family you're turning your back on," my father warned. "Once that door closes, there's no going back." I looked at each of them. The people who shared my blood but had never really seen me, never valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide. "And I know exactly who my real family is." One by one, they filed past me, their expressions a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Bradley was the last to leave, pausing to deliver a final threat. "You're making a huge mistake," he hissed. "We could have helped you manage all this. Now you're on your own." "I always have been," I replied, and firmly closed the door on that chapter of my life. The next day, I contacted a security company to upgrade my home system and called my lawyer to discuss the possibility of a restraining order if necessary. Then I opened my shop as usual, surrounded by the treasures whose stories I had learned to read, whose value I had always recognized even when no one else could see it. In the days following that final confrontation, I moved through a fog of conflicting emotions. Relief mingled with grief, anger with liberation. Cutting ties with toxic family members was both necessary and painful, a complex loss that required its own kind of mourning. For the first week, I jumped every time the phone rang or someone entered the shop. I half expected to see my father's stern face or hear Abigail's demanding voice. The security company had installed additional cameras around my property, and I found myself checking the feeds obsessively. My lawyer had prepared restraining order paperwork ready to file if needed, but there was no further contact from any of them. The silence was both a relief and a strange new wound. How could people who shared my blood walk away so easily once they realized they couldn't use me? Had there ever been any real connection beyond obligation and expectation? 2 weeks after the confrontation, I found myself sitting alone in my living room on a Sunday evening, surrounded by beautiful things but feeling utterly isolated. In that moment of vulnerability, I called Dr. Bennett and scheduled an emergency session. "What you're experiencing is a normal grief response," she assured me during our appointment. "You're not just losing the family you had, you're also mourning the family you wish they could be." Her words resonated deeply. Throughout my life, I'd clung to the hope that someday my parents would truly see me and value me for who I was, rather than who they wanted me to be. That hope had died on my doorstep when they chose potential access to my money over a relationship with their daughter. The hardest part of grief, Dr. Bennett continued, is allowing yourself to feel the full range of emotions without judgment. Anger, sadness, relief, guilt. They can all coexist, and they're all valid. Over the following months, I committed fully to the healing process. I attended therapy sessions twice weekly. I journaled extensively about my childhood, my relationship with Harold, and the complex dynamics that had shaped my family relationships. I learned to recognize the patterns of seeking validation that had kept me tethered to people who couldn't give me what I needed. Most importantly, I began to intentionally nurture the healthy relationships in my life. I hosted small dinner parties for the friends who had supported my business from the beginning. I mentored young history students interested in antique authentication. I joined the board of the local historical society and found community among people who shared my passion for preservation. As my emotional health improved, I channeled my energy into expanding the educational aspect of my business. I converted the second floor of my shop into a small teaching space where I offered workshops on antique identification and authentication techniques. I established a scholarship fund for art history students interested in American artifacts, naming it after Harold. 6 months after cutting ties with my family, I received an invitation to speak at a prestigious antique dealers conference in New York. During the networking reception, I found myself face to face with Abigail. She looked thinner, her designer outfit slightly less polished than usual. She was there representing a client who collected rare books, a wealthy divorce who had retained her legal services after her presentation of the Cabo investment had fallen apart. We exchanged awkward greetings, both acutely aware of the eyes watching our interaction. The industry was small enough that rumors of our family rift had circulated. "You look well," she said stiffly. "Business must be good." "It is," I replied. "How are you?" "Managing." Her eyes darted around the room nervously. "Bradley and I postponed the wedding. There were complications." I nodded, unsurprised. Without my money to bail him out, Bradley's gambling problems had likely escalated. "And Mom and Dad?" I asked more out of politeness than genuine interest. "They sold the house, moving to Florida next month. Downsizing." Her tone was clipped, embarrassed. The second mortgage they had taken out in anticipation of my investment had clearly created financial strain. We spoke for a few more minutes, the conversation never venturing beyond superficial pleasantries. As she turned to leave, she paused. "They still talk about you, you know. They don't understand why you turned your back on family." I smiled sadly. "That's the thing, Abigail. They never understood me at all." Watching her walk away, I felt a surprising sense of peace. I had spent so many years seeking their approval, trying to fit myself into their narrow definition of success. Now I was finally free of that burden. Back home in Portland, I continued building the life I wanted. My foundation funded the restoration of a historic building that became a community center for arts education. My shop expanded to include an online educational platform that reached antique enthusiasts worldwide. I developed deep, meaningful friendships with people who valued me for exactly who I was. 1 year after the confrontation, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was Harold's pocket watch, a simple silver timepiece he had always carried. With it was a note from his sister who had found it while cleaning out the last of his possessions. "Harold wanted you to have this," she wrote. "He said you understood better than anyone the value of things that stand the test of time." I held the watch in my palm, feeling its weight and history. Harold had recognized something in me that my own family could not see. Not just an eye for valuable antiques, but a depth of character that valued authenticity over appearance, substance over status. The journey from being the antique shop girl to becoming a woman who stood firmly in her own worth had been painful but necessary. I had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in millions of dollars or family connections, but in the freedom to live authentically and surround yourself with people who love you for who you are, not what you can provide. The most valuable lesson I learned from my family's betrayal was that sometimes closing a door isn't an ending but a beginning. It creates space for new connections, new growth, and new definitions of family, ones based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and exploitation. That watch sits on my desk now, a daily reminder that the most precious antiques in our lives aren't objects at all, but the authentic connections we forge with people who truly see us. And those, unlike the fortune my family coveted, are treasures no one can take away. Have you ever had to close a door on relationships that were hurting you more than helping? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect your peace even from family. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your worth isn't determined by others' ability to see it. It was there all along, waiting for you to recognize it yourself.